I wanted to make a tribute video for Alumni Night, as in the last year and a half or so, we've lost 3 of our members. All 3 weren't just well-known or popular, but were really beloved members of the club. Dan Barela, John Saldivar, Aswer Elor. I know this was a little bit difficult for really everyone involved, you know, the guys that had not only trained with them over the years, but had heard the stories about these guys. And I think in all the cases, it was a little bit shocking. Everyone knew Dan had cancer and had kind of worked through that and had it in remission for a time, and then it came back. But I don't really think anyone believed that Dan was ever going to die. Johnny had an unexpected heart attack, which really seemingly came out of nowhere at 39. And that was kind of a weird deal for us here, not just because of the tragedy of Johnny dying, but he had just come back to Diablo after like a 6-year hiatus. And he was a guy who was so instrumental in the early years, so we loved having him back. About a month or 2 prior to his death, he had to leave again because of work commitments, and his schedule wasn't lining up, but we had just had him back through again. And then Aswer, at 23, being a victim of violent crime and leaving us. So that was something that for all of us was shocking on all accounts. And then we weren't really able to get together on any of this. You know, I think Dan had a closed service, as did Aswer. So I wanted to make this video as a way of honoring their memories. So years ago, when Aswer was making his first run here, I think it was Jeff Urion who put together this really cool montage. Jeff was very clever in the way that he would assemble these in-house videos. He made one for Dan we're going to watch later on too, but this one with Aswer really, you know, kind of shows him in his element, almost at his Diablo prime, to where he has some big lifts in-house. And then when I think Andreas was the one who took him to the UFC gym. So let's watch that first. So Aswer got really strong really fast here. He came in, it was like 13 and a half, and I used to call him a 275-pound blob. By the time he was 15, where you see him in this video, he was 355 pounds. He ultimately went to like a 675 squat, a 405 bench, and a 615 deadlift. So he was, in my mind at that point, you know, we were training him for football, which is kind of funny in hindsight to think about him playing football. But I was thinking if I was training him to be a power lifter, that he had the great potential to be the youngest person to ever squat over 1,000 pounds. So one of the things that really stuck out to me about Aswer, you always hear the term gentle giant, and usually it's it's just kind of a bunch of nonsense. It just describes someone who's big, who's not currently like attacking someone. But he really was. He was such a good-hearted kid. Really cared about. When he was here, he was always helping out. He was always super respectful, and it was always something where there was a certain detail to his work. I remember one time we were cleaning up, and he was this gigantic kid, and he has this little teeny broom, and he's walking around trying to get like every little bit done, and it just kind of struck me as here's this giant, but at heart he was kind of a little boy. I remember when my daughter Mackenzie met him. This was years ago because she was pretty small, and he walked up to her and he said, "I'm sorry I'm so big," because she was just kind of staring at him like he was gonna eat her or something. He kind of leaned down and said that. So yeah, he was something different. He was a special guy. Everyone knows that Dan Barela was not only a legendary member of Diablo, but just a legend in the sport of powerlifting. But even more legendary than that was his battles with Ken Kim.
What do you think about that? Enjoy it, my skinny-legged Asian friend, because it's going down. August 22nd, Friday, you're going down.
So you've not been humbled as a lifter, especially as a younger or a semi-relevant lifter, until you've been what I dubbed being loafered. Being loafered is the days that Dan would forget to bring his shoes in, so he comes from work wearing his loafers from work and trains in those, and then somehow still manages to beat you in something. I had the unfortunate experience of having this happen myself when Dan and I floor pressed together years ago, and he made like 455 or something ridiculous for, especially being like 60 years old, but I didn't, and I wasn't even wearing loafers. Dan had best lifts of 815 squat. He ultimately made that 600-pound bench press in the 242 division and pulled 655. He still holds the all-time Masters coefficient in the history of the sport of powerlifting. Everyone loved Dan. Everyone who's ever been here and trained with Dan, I think, like I said earlier, I don't think anyone ever thought Dan was going to die. It's like we knew he had cancer. It was kind of like, yeah, so what? He'll beat it. And for a time he did. He had made that 815 squat. Then we found out that he was sick, and he trained through this for like a year, and they had him on all kinds of crazy medication like testosterone suppression therapy. So imagine that as a lifter. That's something you would take. Let that sink in for a second. Testosterone suppression therapy, and all kinds of chemo, and he lost a lot of his muscle mass and gained a lot of body fat. But then he kind of turned that around, and I think the cancer went into remission for a time, and was pushing really hard. And he got all the way back into like Dan Barela shape. In training, he squatted 855, and I had him pegged for something like 885, maybe 905 if it was going to go right at the meet. And like 2 weeks before this meet, he finds out that he's sick again. He still ends up going in. I think he makes like 782, but for as much as Dan did, we were wondering what's going to be next, because he was really on track for it. Was almost like the sky's the limit. He just kept getting stronger the whole time. But one of the greatest guys to ever come through here, really super accomplished in every way. For those who knew him from the Teamster side, he was a huge part of that. He was a huge part of this club. Really the consummate teammate at every level.
More speed on the way down, Dan. Come on.
Come on, Dan.
Followed by Ken Kim, Galen Miranda, Andreas Miles would run out the flight.
Come on, Dan.
Make some noise for Dan. Come on.
Come on now. Knees out the whole time.
Come on.
Back.
Johnny big time, and his brother David came down pretty early on. This is, I think, when we were actually in our very first spot. I'd received a message, an email from David, and these guys would drive from Sunnyvale like 4 times a week to train in Concord. And, you know, in doing that, really kind of anchored that first group. That's what it was about back then, is people were willing to do anything necessary to get stronger. And Johnny and David, although they didn't talk much, we used to call them the silent giants, because you had these gigantic guys who just kept getting bigger and stronger, but never said anything. I think, other than saying "up," me and Johnny maybe exchanged 4 or 5 words, like over like a 10-year span or something. Maybe a few more. It's a slight exaggeration, but that's kind of the gist of it. But even with that, it's like I always considered Johnny a friend, like a super reliable, good guy who I'd consider a friend even outside the context of training at Diablo. Here's a Johnny story that I always laugh about, and ties into one of our other veterans, Ken Kim. Anyone who trained with Johnny knew that he was a lot stronger than he was able to show on the bar, because he was so wild. Like, he would unrack a squat and you had no idea what was going to happen, or he would come out on the bench and any number of things could happen. So one time early on, he's training, he's new, and him and Ken Kim were training together. And I look over at Garrett Harper, who was coaching also on the floor at that time, and I said, man, if I can get these 2 guys to an elite total, then I'll become the 2nd greatest strength coach at all time. And he looked at him and he laughed and laughed, because there was Kenny, probably all 180 pounds of him, dripping wet at the time, and there's Johnny flailing about wildly. But he got really, really strong too. Johnny was our first 700-pound bencher, and did it in a way that he probably was strong enough to bench 800, which especially back then is just a ridiculous number and really a world-class bench. He had to earn that elite though. The squat and the deadlift did not come naturally. He squatted somewhere in the mid to high 7s, I think, and his deadlift, I think, wasn't even 600. So this is how uncomfortable the deadlift was for Johnny. I remember one time he had a full-on seizure in the gym, setting up for a deadlift. I had no idea what had happened. He set up, he kind of let go of the bar, rolled backward, and started just having a seizure. So yeah, I have a lot of memories of the early days and Johnny training, but great guy. You know, he always went to the meets to help, even when he wasn't lifting. And this would include like flying out of state on his dime to be a part of it. That's, I think, something that's kind of missing today. You know, by and large, we used to roll out 10, 12 deep to a meet and have 5 or 6 guys flying out to help. And Johnny and David were always guys that were helping one way or another, and then really carved a niche in the club with their own lifting. Both became tremendous lifters and really have a place in our history. Johnny's wife, John, too, was super supportive of his lifting, to the point where she actually became a referee, and I think she got to be in the chair, maybe not when he was lifting, but I think she got to ref the last meet that he lifted in for us. So that was always a really cool thing, and I talked to John too a bit when Johnny came back, and she was just super excited that he was part of this again. As was I. I was really surprised when he was able to come back, and then pretty sad when he left again, and then of course shocked when he passed away, as I think all of us were.
711 pounds. Joe's second attempt this weight today. Let's get behind him on this. He's
Got it?
and that's a good lift.